Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Stevie Ray Vaughan's amps and may be able to help you make a decision as to what kind of amp you might want to get a Stevie Ray Vaughan sound. I think the most important element of any amp that Stevie used was they were all tube amplifiers. Every amp Stevie used, Marshall, Dumble, Fender, was a tube amplifier. Now, if you're just starting off, just get any Fender amplifier that makes sound. If you're a beginner, if you're just trying to learn how to play guitar, just get an amplifier by Fender, practice amp even. Don't worry if it's solid state or tube. Just get you a Fender amp that gets you sound that you can hear. Now, as you kind of move up, or if you have the money, go for a tube amp. So that's real important that your amp be a tube amp. That's all Stevie played was tube amps. Now, here's an equipment list from the summer of '83, insurance purposes. And so it's documented he had a 100-watt Marshall combo tube amp, Fender Vibroverbs tube amps, and these were heavily modified, by the way. These were not stock Vibroverbs. Super reverb. This is an important component of Stevie's sound, was he mixed amplifiers together to get a tone. So he played more than one amp live. When I saw him play, he had 3 amps on stage. They were all Fenders. So he did that to get a tone, also to get a volume, to get a sound. He was playing with a band most of the time. So when you play with the band, you have to have a loud sound. And so he combined amplifiers to get volume as well as to create a mixture of tones there that he liked. On the in-step record, he was actually playing 32 amplifiers. He had 32 amplifiers plugged in. So if you're going for the tone on in-step, it's going to be difficult. One of the main amps that Stevie played was Fender, 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 Fender. So in my opinion, my own personal opinion, if you could choose one amp to sound like Stevie, it would be a Fender amp. Now that amp is up to you, because even when Stevie had his Vibroverb, it was heavily modified. This is one that was a CESAR Diaz modification. Fender put out a Vibroverb that was modified by CESAR Diaz. This is the amp. But a regular amp, a regular Vibroverb, may or may not sound as good to you. You might want a Twin. You might want a Princeton. You might want a super reverb. You might want a Bassman. You know, there's these amps, these Fender amps contain circuits. And those circuits, you know, are pretty much where the sound comes from, the circuits in the tubes. And like I said, with Stevie, his Vibroverb was heavily modified by CESAR Diaz. So, but if I was going to get one amp to sound like Stevie, it would be a Fender. This guy made a list of amps he saw Stevie using. He saw in 1980 he was using 2 Vibroverbs. At Montreux, he was using 2 Music Man twin black faces. So he was using Music Man twins there, probably because it was what they call backline, meaning they were provided by the venue or the festival. In 83, one vibroverb and one super reverb together. So he wasn't just getting the vibroverb tone or the super reverb tone, he was getting a combination of both. Then in 85, two vibroverbs and the Dumble steel string slinger. Here he's using one Marshall and one Dumble. And in this interview here, he says, right now, as of now, I'm using a Marshall only and a Dumble only. And this is the Dumble he's talking about, the Dumble steel string singer, which was built for him, custom amp. It's 220 grand. So most people are not going to be able to afford 220 grand for an amp. But could you afford a Marshall? Sure. Can you afford a Fender? Maybe. But there's a lot of Marshalls out there. And Stevie did use Marshall. He used a Marshall sound, and this is him in Nashville. I mean, at the country club. I'm sorry, at the Cotton Club, and he's using 5 amplifiers. He's got 2 of these stacked on top of each other. These are little Marshall combos, tube amps stacked on top of each other. Can't see the one down here, but there's one down here. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4, and back here he's got a Marshall head on a speaker cabinet. And he's using that Charlie's guitar with the Dan Electro pickups in it. So he's not even using number 1 here. He's not using number 1, and he's not using Fender amplifiers. So this is all Marshall, and he's getting a great Stevie tone. You could feasibly get the Stevie tone with the Marshall. I would go with a Fender. On this Fender Guru site, this guy says, and I think quite insightfully, you can nail the SRV tone close enough with small Fender amps too. You can nail the SRV tone close enough with small Fender amps. That means you don't need, in his opinion, you don't need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Marshalls together to nail the Stevie tone. You can get it with a smaller Stevie amp, with a smaller Fender amp. So, in my opinion, even though Stevie's playing Marshalls here, there's a film of him on the Tonight Show playing 2 Fender Bassman reissues, which he supposedly owned. So, and that was near the end of his life. So he might have, at his next tour, he might have taken out 2 Fender Bassmans. He wasn't completely set in the exact amps that he would use. Like I said, the list here, he was using 2 twins right here. 2 vibroverb in Tokyo, 2 vibroverbs, 1 super, and 2 twins. A late 70s silver and an 80s blackface reissue. Or blackface, and I'm sorry, mid 80s blackface. So he's using a mid 80s twin, a late 70s twin, a blackface super, and two vibroverbs. In Nashville, he was using 1 JCM 800 and 1 super reverb, and the Dumble. So he wasn't just stuck on one amp. He wasn't just stuck on using 1 amp. So, get you a tube amp, okay? And I would start with Fender. I would start with a Fender amplifier to try to get my tone, okay? Now, as stated, it could be a larger amplifier, it could be a smaller amplifier, it could be a blackface, could be a reissue blackface, could be a modern day, but you want it to be a tube amp, okay? And then if you want to get an amp to couple it with, Marshall's probably a pretty good bet. You don't have to get a massive 100-watt Marshall. You can get a little Marshall combo here that's a tube amp with like a 112 in it or a 115 in it. Or get another Fender, get 2 Fenders. You know, go try out several amplifiers, because the amplifiers do change a little bit. And what you're going to have to understand is on the Vibroverb, you know, CESAR modified it big time. Did you modify his amps? Yes, quite a lot. So even though on this list here it says, you know, he played a Vibroverb, well, CESAR's telling you from his own mouth, yeah, I changed them quite a lot. I changed the 68K input to 100K. There's a lot of mods there. So that's why I'm saying find your amp. Your amp may not be modded, or you may be able to find a Fender modded amp already modded by somebody, modified by somebody. So go and on your quest, you might want a 70s. You might want a silver face reverb. You might want a black face twin reverb. You might want a black face basement. You might want a silver face basement. You might want a super reverb. You might want a Princeton. You might want a deluxe. You might want a certain circuit in that basement. But whatever it is, get a tube amp and find your amp that you're comfortable with playing for your situation. Stevie played in bands. Stevie played in bands almost all the time that you've ever seen him. He's playing with a band, so he had to be loud. So if you're in a band, you might choose a bigger amplifier. You might choose a 100-watt amplifier. If you're in your room, you might be able to find a small little Fender amplifier that works great for you, for recording purposes, for just jamming in your room, for practicing. So the main important point is that it's a tube amp. That's one thing that you don't really want to compromise on unless you don't have the money. If you have the money, get a tube amp. Secondly, I would say Fender tube amp. Thirdly, I would go Marshall tube amp. So in terms of those, you can't go wrong. Now, in terms of the setting, once again, we get Stevie playing loud. Stevie had his amps turned up, and you get a certain tone when you turn your amp up. Stevie also said his amp, CESAR says, CESAR Diaz says in this article, which I'll put a link to. This is the last great interview with CESAR Diaz, it's called. He talks about a lot of Stevie stuff in here, man. And he says that Stevie was superstitious and set his knobs at 6. And so CESAR had to go and take the knob, and when it said 6 on the dial, he would have it at 10. You know, so it's almost impossible to look at the settings on Stevie's amp for a picture and tell what they actually were. But there's one thing you can guarantee: they were loud. Stevie played loud. Loud. Now, in the modern day, you can get an amp, what they call an attenuator. An attenuator, you plug your amp into the attenuator, then you plug it out into a speaker, and you can turn the amp way up, and then this attenuator acts as a volume control. So you can have your amp cranked up in terms of the amp being output of the amp, but the volume of the amp is controlled by the attenuator. So you can play with an amp tone, what I call just railing, and the amp volume at a lower level. These come in great, come in very handy for the studio. They come in very handy for live playing. They're really neat little devices. There's also something called a power soak, which is very similar to an attenuator, where it takes the input from the amplifier and just soaks it all up. Then you put it out into a speaker, and so you can turn it down with that too. So you want a power soak or an attenuator. if you're having to play at lower volumes, but you want your amp just cranking. Because what happens with any amp is when you turn it up, a tube amp, not any amp, I'm sorry, a tube amp, is the tone changes when you turn it up. A Fender volume knob only works to about 3 or 4. And anything past that is really just what I call it folding back in on itself. You're just getting the amp kind of folding back in on itself in that tube loop. So Stevie played his amps loud. They were being pushed hard. And that is, you know, one key to a sound when you're hearing it. It's loud. So in terms of settings, you do want to be pushing your amp, and that's just, my opinion. You may get a great sound with your amp turned down. You may get the exact sound that you want, that you think sounds just like the Stevie sound that you want at a lower volume, at a lower setting. But for me, the amp's got to be turned up, 6, 7, 8, somewhere around there. I believe Stevie usually plays his on 8. And then, during Voodoo Child, you can see him sometimes going around and turning it up all the way to 10. So in terms of settings, you do want to have your amp pretty hot. You want to have your amp running pretty hot. So you want a tube amp, mostly Fender, secondly Marshall, and you want to have the amp cranked up pretty loud. If you get these things involved in your sound, you will achieve, I believe you'll achieve a pretty good tone, and you could get close to a Stevie sound with that formula there. Good luck.